Today, I'm going to be telling you about two different true crime cases that are connected by a single theme. These are stories that start out with seemingly wholesome beginnings, only to take incredibly dark turns. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, a heads up, this is a recurring series we've been doing on the channel, so if you're interested in these types of cases and haven't seen the other videos we've done, be sure to check those out next. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In the summer of 2017, Joseph Shaw was at a good place in life. The 44-year-old father of three was working a steady job in construction. He had his own apartment in the city of Brockton, Massachusetts, and he was surrounded by a large circle of family and friends who loved and cared about him very much. Well, this might sound like a fairly humble list of accomplishments. For Joseph, this was a big deal. Things for him had definitely not always been this stable. He'd had plenty of struggles in the past, including with drugs, and for some time he had actually found himself homeless. As anyone who's experienced homelessness in their lives will tell you, getting out of that situation once you're in it is no small feat. Joseph had since managed to turn things around for himself, and understandably, he was proud of that. Of course, Joseph hadn't done this all alone. He'd had a lot of support from his loved ones, but also from the local shelter and food bank system. And this was something he had not forgotten about. Once he was back on his feet, he started volunteering at the same shelter where he had stayed. For him, it was a small way that he could give back and provide the kind of help that was given to him when he was most in need. By all accounts, Joseph was an incredibly devoted volunteer. He wasn't just there to put in some hours or feel good about himself. He really took the time to get to know people. He would sit and talk with the residents of the shelter, really listen and discuss their problems, and connected with them in a very genuine way. Part of this is likely because he could relate to them for obvious reasons, but there was a deeper layer than that as well. According to those that knew him, he had this uncanny instinct for kind of sensing when people needed someone to talk to, and he was really good with people in general. For many of the people at the shelter, Joseph served as this sort of inspirational and aspirational figure. You know, a guy who had gone from former shelter resident to volunteer and seemed to be on the right path. Unfortunately, though, this heartwarming story was one that would have a pretty devastating end. On July 17th, 2017, Brockton police received a call from some of Joseph's family members. They said that they wanted to report him missing. They hadn't been able to get a hold of him, and they were worried that he might be in danger. The family members explained that the last time they had seen Joseph was on July 15th, which was a Saturday. That weekend, there had been a couple of different family events happening, so he had been kind of bouncing around between different parties. This had continued into the early hours of the following morning. The last person to hear from Joseph was his nephew, who exchanged texts with him around 2 a.m. In those texts, Joseph said he would be in touch later that day. But since then, it had been complete silence. Now, given Joseph's history, the immediate fear was that this was something drug-related. Maybe he'd started using again, and he'd gone off somewhere. Or worse, maybe he'd suffered an overdose. The only thing his loved ones knew for sure was that it was extremely unlike him to disappear without at least giving them a heads up. The first place family members had looked for Joseph was at his apartment on Green Street. As a strange little bit of trivia, this building, which is known as the John J. Whipple House, was one of the first private dwellings in the United States to be wired with electricity by Thomas Edison. Anyway, the house had long since been converted into a multi-family residence, and Joseph had a bachelor unit on the third floor. But when loved ones went looking for him there, he was nowhere to be found. His apartment wasn't sitting empty, though. All of his belongings were still there. So was a 33-year-old woman named Kathryn Podgurksi. Joseph's family members knew Kathryn. In fact, Joseph had recently introduced them to her. They had met while he was working at the shelter. Kathryn was homeless, and Joseph had ended up offering to let her stay with him for a while. They had been living together for a few weeks now, and had also developed a bit of a romantic relationship as well. When family members asked Kathryn what was going on, initially she seemed kind of hesitant to speak with them. But after letting them in, it didn't look like anything out of the ordinary was going on. Aside from Joseph not being there. Kathryn said she didn't open up the door right away because she had been smoking in the apartment and she knew she wasn't supposed to be. She had been quickly spraying some air freshener to cover this up and said that the only reason she was doing this was because she was nervous. She said she also hadn't seen Joseph since July 15th and was getting more and more worried. For the last couple of days, she'd kind of just been pacing around the house hoping that Joseph would come home. At one point, Kathryn broke down crying, saying that she had no idea where he could be. After receiving all of this information from Joseph's family, police launched an investigation. At the same time, dozens of his loved ones began desperately searching for him. They returned to his apartment multiple times looking for any clues and were aided by many of the friends and residents he knew at the homeless shelter where he volunteered. To everyone's frustration, over the next few days, very little progress was made, though. It was as if Joseph Shaw had simply vanished. Unfortunately, what nobody knew was that he was much closer than they realized, just not in the way that anyone had hoped. On the evening of July 21st, so 6 days after Joseph was last seen, Brockton police got a call out of the blue from a woman named Judith Thomas. Judith explained that she had just received an alarming text message from her sister. The text message was something about how she and her boyfriend had been robbed. She claimed 2 people had broken into their place, tried to steal money and drugs, and that things had turned violent. Her sister stated her boyfriend had been killed and that she had been threatened into trying to cover up what had happened. Judith said she didn't think this story was actually true. Her sister had a history of schizophrenia and she thought she was probably having a bad episode. Still, she gave them an address where she believed her sister was staying at the local Elm Court Hotel. She also gave police her sister's name. It was Kathryn Podgurski. When officers went out to the hotel, they found Kathryn, who repeated many of the same details that they had already heard. She said that she and Joseph had been at his apartment on Green Street a few nights ago when 2 random men had broken in. She said Joseph made too much noise while struggling with the robbers and that they had ended up killing him. After that, they told her she needed to clean up the crime scene. She claimed she hadn't come forward earlier because these same men had threatened her. She also told police something else. They should go back to Joseph's apartment and look in the wardrobe. Sure enough, after forcing their way inside Joseph's apartment, officers were immediately hit with the unmistakable odor of decomposition. When they opened up the wardrobe Kathryn was referring to, they were met with an absolutely horrifying sight. Buried under clothes, bedding, and a chair was Joseph's body. Well, most of it. You see, some of his limbs had clearly been cut off and were missing. That wasn't all, though. The inside of the wardrobe had been filled with cat litter and generous amounts of Lysol spray, presumably to mask the smell of what was inside. So, yeah, that entire time Joseph was missing, his worried friends and family members had been just feet away from his body. Even though Kathryn's tip about where to find Joseph checked out, understandably, authorities were suspicious. It turned out they were right to be, because basically everything she had told them other than the location of the body was a lie. Not only were there no signs that a break-in had ever occurred at the apartment, none of the details Kathryn gave about the supposed robbery matched evidence at the scene. An autopsy revealed that Joseph had been stabbed more than 40 times. But despite this, there was no blood in the areas where Kathryn claimed the struggle between him and the attackers had taken place. Instead, when police flipped Joseph's mattress, they found a large pool of blood soaked into it. The amount suggested that he had likely laid there dying for some time before he finally succumbed to his injuries. Kathryn was the one that stabbed him to death, and this also meant that at any point she could have called for help, and Joseph might have survived. Instead, Kathryn tried to hide all of the evidence of the crime and make it seem like Joseph had disappeared. During those exchanges with his family, she wasn't nervous because she was worried about him. She was nervous because she thought she was going to be found out. And that air freshener she was spraying wasn't to cover the smell of smoke. It was to cover up the smell of Joseph's body, which she had been living with for days. Sadly, it seems that Joseph's family was not looped in on any of these details after Kathryn was arrested. Instead, they heard all of this for the first time during her arraignment on July 24th. Several of Joseph's loved ones were caught so off guard by these details that they ran from the courtroom sobbing and completely overwhelmed with grief. As if this weren't bad enough, the family was forced to endure at least one other totally unnecessary gut punch, which unbelievably happened later that same day. After leaving the court, a few of them were let back into his apartment to collect some of his belongings. As they were gathering a few items, Joseph's niece, Jacinda, found a backpack with what looked like blood on the zipper. The bag seemed pretty heavy when she picked it up, so she decided to open it and see what was in there. As soon as she did, part of a foot came popping out. It turned out police had not done a thorough search of the crime scene. Joseph's missing remains were still there and had been hidden in this bag and at least one other. I'm sure you're wondering why all of this happened, and of course, this is something Joseph's family members desperately wanted to know as well. However, they were denied this by Kathryn, who continued to stick to her story about the phony break-in and insist that she hadn't done anything wrong. That being said, there are theories, most of which involve the fact that Joseph had wanted Kathryn to move out of his apartment. Apparently, she did a whole fake pregnancy thing that really upset him and rubbed him the wrong way, and he had told her she needed to leave. According to statements made by friends, family, and neighbors, this conversation had happened right before Joseph disappeared. At the end of a 5-day trial in December of 2021, Kathryn Podgurski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the summer of 2023, the Sharkey family of Liverpool, England, were living what you might call an average life. I don't mean that as an insult in any way, just more in the sense that there was nothing in particular that stood out about them. They weren't rich or poor, they didn't lead super eventful lives, but there was nothing wrong with their lives either. They were comfortable and happy, they fit well into their community, and they were well liked by friends and neighbors. Husband and wife, Neil and Joanne, had been together for over 30 years, and in that time they had lived in the same house in a quiet little section of Liverpool's Croxteth area. They had moved there in 1991, shortly after they got married. The whole suburb was a new build, so with everyone kind of arriving at the same time, people really got to know each other. This was especially true when people started having children. With a lot of younger families, they ended up having kids that were around the same age, and the neighborhood became fairly tight-knit. Neil and Joanne were no exception. Their son Matthew was born in 1996, and like all the other kids in the neighborhood, he grew up playing outside in the front yard. It was that classic sort of thing where the kids would be running up and down the street, and the parents would watch while chatting, sharing a few drinks, or doing other chores. In those days, most of the time, it was Joanne who was seen in the neighborhood. It wasn't that Neil was unfriendly or anything. He was definitely social when he had the time, but he often worked jobs that had late or long hours, so he wasn't around as often. Joanne also had a full-time job. She worked as a housing benefit officer, but she was the one primarily taking care of Matthew. One of her favorite things to do was tend to the garden while he was having fun outside. At this point, in 2023, Matthew had long since grown up. He was now in his late 20s, had moved out, and had a home of his own. Joanne and Neil, meanwhile, were in their mid-50s, trying to get the most out of their last few working years before retirement. So, yeah, you get what I mean. The Sharkeys were about as typical a family as you could find. Well, almost. You see, one member of the family had a secret that they had been keeping for a very long time. This secret would finally be exposed at the end of July of that year, and it would happen when the family got an unexpected knock at their front door. In order to understand what that knock was about and who was at the door, though, first, we have to go back more than 25 years. On March 14th, 1998, a man in the town of Warrington, England, which is located about 20 miles east of Liverpool, was out for his morning walk with his dog. It was a Saturday, so he was a little later getting out of the house than usual. He left shortly after 10:30 a.m., deciding he would walk a trail just behind the subdivision where he lived. Since it was a weekend, he also took his young son with him. This area was surrounded by woods, but it was also right near a pretty large plot of land leading to the Gulliver's World theme park. So it was a convenient place to walk because the paths leading to the park were paved and well maintained. As the man and his son were walking that morning, though, they spotted something they'd never seen before. In a section of trees just off one of the paths was a black plastic trash bag that had been tightly knotted shut. Now, this was unusual because, as I said, this area was generally well taken care of, so not the kind of place where random trash would typically be dumped or go unnoticed. In fact, the whole thing was strange enough to the man that he decided to investigate further. After picking up a stick, he poked a small hole through the bag to try and see what was inside. His curiosity was about to turn to terror, though. As soon as he got a glimpse of what was in the bag, he immediately grabbed his son and his dog and ran to get help. One of the first people to arrive at the scene was a doctor who just happened to be at the theme park at the time. When the man found him, he said, "I've just come across something awful. There is this bag that's been left at the side of one of the paths, and I'm pretty sure that there's a baby inside." The doctor was able to confirm the chilling discovery along with police, who arrived a short time later. To everyone's horror, inside of the plastic trash bag was a baby boy. Heartbreakingly, there was nothing anyone could do. He was already dead, and had been for at least a couple of days. An autopsy quickly added further gut-wrenching details. This boy was a newborn who had been delivered healthy and at full term. In other words, this was not the result of complications or some other problem during labor. He had been killed. Initially, the baby's cause of death was ruled to be asphyxiation. However, this was later changed to unascertained. You see, while there were signs that he had been suffocated, he also had other injuries, including bruising to his head and neck. Most disturbing of all, wads of tissue paper had been stuffed into his mouth. It was estimated he had only been alive for a few minutes before he was killed. As you might imagine, when news of the awful situation made its way out to the public, it became a big story. People in the community wanted to know, how could something like this happen? And more importantly, who would do something like this? The case was met with an equally large response from police. They did a huge campaign of door-knocking and interviews with residents in the area, looking for any potential leads or clues about the identity of the infant's parents. A lot of these inquiries happened in the Callans area of Warrington, which is located a little bit north of where the boy's body was discovered. As a result, he came to be known as Baby Callum. At the time that this was happening, police were working another angle of the investigation as well. In addition to Baby Callum's DNA, they had also been able to recover DNA from the unknown mother. You see, the bag the boy had been found in was actually a bag within a bag, and this interior plastic bag had some of the mother's blood on it as well. Using this evidence, authorities were eventually able to conduct a mass campaign of DNA testing. The DNA of at least 500 local women was analyzed against the samples taken from the plastic bag and Baby Callum. And in some cases, parents brought their own teenage daughters in on suspicion that they might be the unknown mother. However, none of these tests proved to be a match. Police branched out, scouring hospitals, midwife services, schools, and medical practices, looking for any births that might line up with their timeline. Unfortunately, they were met with nothing but dead ends, and eventually, the case went cold. A funeral service was held for Baby Callum a few months later, and he was buried at a local cemetery. A headstone that was paid for with money raised by the public read, quote, "Baby Callum, precious child of God, laid to rest July 27th, 1998, with love from the people of Warrington." This is essentially where things would stay for more than 2.5 decades. That was until the summer of 2023. And this brings us back to that knock at the front door of the Sharkey residence. You see, the previous year, the Baby Callum case was re-examined by the Cheshire Constabulary's Major Crime Review Team. During this new investigation, police had followed up on various elements of the case, part of which included resubmitting DNA evidence to the national databases. Now, this had been done many times in the past, and every time previously it had come up empty. However, this time there was a partial match. That match was to Matthew Sharkey, who had since been arrested in connection with a completely unrelated case. Upon further investigation, detectives were able to determine that Baby Callum was Matthew's little brother. That led police to Joanne and Neil Sharkey, who were the parents they had been looking for all these years. On the morning of July 28, 2023, officers from the Cheshire Police showed up at the Sharkey residence and told Neil and Joanne that they needed to come in and speak to them. Joanne was the first to be sat down, which is when officers revealed why they were there.
Please listen carefully to what I'm going to say. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence. I'm not here to judge you, and I'm not here to cause any unnecessary anguish for you, but we're involved in an investigation regarding a baby who was found deceased in woodlands on the outskirts of Warrington in 1998. So therefore, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder on that child, and also for concealing the birth of that child. Do you understand what I've just said? Okay. I know what I've just said may come as a huge shock to you, and obviously causes you distress, but we are professional officers. We're going to treat you with the utmost respect, and if you want me to, I can explain now what's going to happen. Okay?
As you can see, Joanne looks quite stunned while the officer is speaking, but as it turned out, she wouldn't be the only one receiving a surprise that day. Unbeknownst to police, she was about to drop a horrifying bombshell.
When we leave...
Let's just say he doesn't know anything about this.
I don't want to talk to you
Okay.
about the allegations themselves, because we should be doing that in custody. So please don't say anything about the allegations now, okay?
It turned out that not only did Neil not know anything about the death of their second child, he had never known about the child, period. In fact, no one other than Joanne Sharkey had ever been aware that any of this had happened. As police would learn in subsequent interviews, Joanne had realized that she was pregnant in the summer of 1997. However, she had kept this a complete secret from everyone else in her life. You see, what nobody around Joanne knew was just how much she was struggling with her mental health at the time. She had been suffering a severe case of postpartum depression ever since Matthew's birth about a year and a half earlier. And though the people closest to her could kind of tell she wasn't her usual self, no one really understood how bad things were. You might be thinking, how do you hide a pregnancy to full term without anyone noticing? Well, as I said, Neil really wasn't around a whole lot. Between Joanne being busy caring for Matthew, working a full-time job, and Neil having a very different work schedule, it was almost like they were living completely separate lives. During this time, Joanne wore baggy clothing, and she had lost a lot of weight, which further helped to hide what was going on. On top of this, she started keeping everyone else who was close to her at arm's length. Of course, this only compounded her feeling of loneliness and isolation, and made her mental health symptoms worse. But Joanne was worried that if she told anyone what was going on in her head, she'd be looked at as a bad mother. And she was terrified of having Matthew taken away from her. So even though part of her was well aware that she was pregnant, Joanne convinced herself that this wasn't happening, that this couldn't be happening. That was until one day a few months later in March of 1998, when she went into labor in the bathroom of her home. Joanne told investigators that at the time she was home alone, and that everything moved along relatively fast. The details about exactly what took place next still aren't definitively known. It appears that even Joanne herself wasn't clear on her actions. I don't mean this in the way like where she wasn't willing to talk or she was trying to make herself look better. According to police, she was fully cooperative and answered every question they asked, but it was like she had mentally blocked many of the specifics out. What she did tell them was this, quote, The infant was born. I just had to make him quiet. I sort of reached down. I must have been on the floor at this point. I've covered his nose, his mouth. It just couldn't make that noise. Just had to be quiet. Joanne had similarly few details about what had happened after baby Callum had died. She said she remembered the plastic bags and driving for roughly 40 minutes away from her home, but not much more than that. Despite the gaps in her recollection, Joanne was clear that she blamed herself entirely for what had happened. She said she was completely sickened by what she had done and had wanted to do something about it for years, but she could never bring herself to fully face the truth about what had happened. She told police, quote, "I couldn't actually say the words. It's not easy to live with all that time. I thought this would happen. You don't get away with anything forever. It's haunting. Something you think about every day. You try and push it out, but it creeps back in. You carry on with your life. You go to work and you do Christmas and you do Easter, but this is always in your head." Initially, both Joanne and Neil were arrested, but after several more months of investigation, police were satisfied that Neil never knew anything about what had happened. Joanne was charged with murder as well as concealing the birth of a child. When the case went to trial in March of 2025, Joanne pleaded guilty to that second charge, though the first offense was lowered to manslaughter on the basis of diminished responsibility. Both the prosecution and the judge in the case said that they were satisfied that she was suffering from a moderate to severe depressive illness at the time of the crime, one which, quote, substantially impaired her ability to form rational judgment and exercise self-control. They also noted that Joanne had seemingly done her best to give police as much information as possible following her arrest, and that she had fully cooperated with the investigation. On April 4th, she was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, though the sentence was suspended for 2 years. She was also ordered to complete rehabilitation activities, as well as a 12-month mental health treatment program. During the hearing, both Neil and Matthew gave statements in Joanne's defense, saying that while they were also devastated by what had happened, it didn't at all map on to the person that they knew. Matthew wrote in part, quote, "Growing up, I was lucky to have my mom. She always looked after and protected me. I always had everything I needed. I was always loved and had support. I never knew if my mom was having a tough time, as she was always good at putting a brave face on. We are still all grieving over what has happened. We as a family are supporting my mom and standing by her." Neil's statement was very similar, though it seems he also felt responsibility for what had happened. He wrote in part, quote, "I was not the greatest husband and father. It was all left to Joanne. Joanne was an amazing mother to Matthew. She has single-handedly raised Matthew to be one of the nicest people I've known. There's a piece of me that has disappeared and will never come back. I blame myself for what happened. I was not the easiest person to live with. It was difficult. I'm supporting Joanne and always will." I suspect that this is going to be a controversial one in the comments section, and I know I certainly have mixed feelings about this case as a whole. I mean, it's hard not to have a strong visceral reaction of both disgust and anger anytime there's a crime like this involving an innocent and defenseless child. That being said, I think the thing that I've really taken away from this one, and what I really can't stop thinking about, is just how scary and awful living with mental illness can be. You know, the way that the human mind can kind of be hijacked and can create this situation where otherwise nice and normal people are capable of unfathomable things. I think that's what makes this case truly horrifying. It's that in some ways, we're all susceptible to this kind of darkness. Just something to consider.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.